It's my honor and honor of the Chamber to welcome now Sir Christopher Pissarides, Regius Professor of Economics from the London School of Economics and the Nobel Laureate of 2010 in Economic Sciences. With him, we have Mr. Panos Papazoglou, Managing Director of EY and member of the board of the American-Hellenic Chamber of Commerce. Mr. Pissarides, it's a pleasure to have you with us. The floor is yours to address our summit and, of course, to Panos to moderate the discussion afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Elias. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening or good morning, depending on which time zone you are following us today. Before introducing our esteemed guest, allow me a very short intro. In 2009, Greece started spiraling down a debt crisis, which not only affected the economy, but has left a strong imprint on the country's social fabric. The crisis unearthed structural deficiencies in several critical sectors of our economy. Deficiencies which obstructed sustainable growth and which historically were obstacles to further progress. But it also shed light on areas that should be at the center of our attention if we want to transform our country and take the next step forward. To make this happen, bridging the investment gap of the last 20 years by creating a much friendlier environment has to be a priority. An environment that will attract quality investments with added value for the economy and the society. We find ourselves in an area of increased focus on long-term value, sustainability, and environmental protection that engenders new challenges, but also new opportunities for Greece. Opportunities we should not let slip if we wish to achieve future growth and prosperity. To get there, however, we need to work hard on the basis of a well-defined plan. In November 2020, the Pissarides Committee presented its report on the growth of the Greek economy for the next few years. This report is a guide on what we need to do to make this leap. At this point, it's a great honor to welcoming Professor Sir Christopher Pissarides, as Elias said, 2010 Nobel winner and Regius Professor of Economics at London School of Economics. Sir Pissarides doesn't need any special introduction. His work actually speaks volumes by itself. So without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Sir Christopher Pissarides. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Papazoglou. I'm sorry I cannot be there with you. I'm sure you understand the reasons of these travel restrictions that we have. My topic today is, was said just now, is about sustainable and inclusive economic growth. Although I did chair the committee and we did produce a report on the Greek economy, I'm going to bring that in indirectly towards the end. Following this presentation, there will be discussion with the participation of the deputy chair of our committee, Professor Vetas, where the plan will be discussed in more detail. But what I want to do is to talk generally about economic growth and what we need to do to make sure that that growth is both sustainable and inclusive, which is a very big problem that's facing all industrial nations nowadays. I have to say that I do believe that we know how to bring about economic growth nowadays. If you see countries that don't have economic growth, the fault is not with the economists, because the economists know what to recommend. The fault is with politicians and policy making. You only need to compare North and South Korea to realize that it's not the economist's fault and that South Korea is leaps and bounds ahead of North Korea. Or compare China today with China in 1980. It's the policy, it's the change in policy that can ensure that economic growth is followed. However, what economists are not very good at, even when politicians are well-meaning, is how to make sure that that growth is both sustainable and inclusive. So here I am. I hope you can see slide one, yes. There used to be a saying which goes back a long way. In fact, I think the Chinese had a saying that was along these lines, which wouldn't surprise me because the Chinese have a saying about everything you can ever think of. And it was popularized by President John Kennedy in the 1960s, where the idea was that if there is economic growth, then everyone benefits. In fact, JFK used it in his war against poverty to say that all we need to do is to make sure that the economy grows and everyone will benefit. It's the idea that if there is a tide, boats will rise in that tide. However, this is not the case today. The 1960s actually was probably the last decade where we were justified to think of tide raising all boats. I could explain that, but I don't have time, so I'm not going to. And nowadays, though, the story is completely different. The cartoon that I'm choosing, in fact, shows that 99% of the boats just don't rise and 1% rises, which in fact has been more or less the case in the United States since the recovery from the pandemic a couple of years ago. So the question really is, what can we do to make sure that more boats than the 1%, or if you want the 10% or whatever, how can we make sure that the 90 plus rises, if not the 100%? Now, it is the case that growth comes from innovation and from a good from a good institutional structure. We don't all need to, excuse me, something went in with my technology here. We don't all need to innovate. What we need to do, however, is to make sure that we do apply the innovation in a way that is beneficial to everyone. Now, excuse me a minute again. Now, so the key question that is facing us now is not whether we're going to grow or not, but it's whether the growth that we're experiencing today, whether it's possible to benefit all. And I do believe that it is possible that we can make growth benefit all today. However, to achieve that, we need the collaboration of all the three social partners, to use European Union language: the employers, the workforce, and the government. The way I look at growth today is that it's an enabler, but it needs to be pushed along. As our classical predecessor used to say, you can't sit back and expect everyone from Athena. You have to move your hand as well, and that's what I want to focus on. Now, first one or two small definitions. What do we mean by sustainable? Sustainable in the sense that growth will be ongoing, and it's inclusive in the sense that it benefits all. Now, when we talk about sustainability nowadays, people think of environmental issues. However, I'm not going to address environmental issues, mainly because of limitations on time. And I'm going to focus instead on what you might call social sustainability. Are we making sure that the labor market delivers, that it gives a good set of jobs, that it is organized in a way that everyone participating is happy, that doesn't want to seek alternatives, which is non-compliance, and so on. So that's what I mean by sustainability. Inclusiveness, it means, is everyone benefiting from that growth? And in fact, the two go together in that if there is inclusiveness, then it's much more likely that, that the growth will be sustainable, that they would be sustainable as well. Now, innovation today is taking place at a much faster pace than in the past. It's both invented faster and is spreading much faster. You don't really need to look beyond the smartphone and artificial intelligence to realize how fast innovation is taking place. Before the smartphone, something like 7 or 8 years between inventing something and seeing it being spread was considered to be a very, very short time. well, the smartphone penetrated the majority of the population much before the 7 years were over. There is some justification because of that speed that some people call it the fourth industrial revolution. It is more or less at the scale of a revolution. The implications of that speed of innovation is that when we look at production, is that production is getting automated. Robotics, artificial intelligence, the use of sophisticated supply chains, which in fact recently have been suffering, but they're still there. They're making production rely much more on machinery than it used to be. And what's more worrying for managers of industry is that it's relying in a way that there is fear that they may not be able to understand well what's going on. Excuse me, this technology is just now, as a result of these changes, of course, work is not what it used to be. If workers used to go to work at 9 o'clock, at least in the Northern European countries, work until 5, go back home, they knew what they were doing. Now they're expected to do different things, they're expected to be flexibility at work and so on. So workers need to adapt to the substantial changes that we're seeing in production. Now, is that change for the better? Well, it could be, as I was saying before, and good innovation is one that ensures that workers benefit from through good work and not through transfers. There is a view, which I very frequently come across, which is, in my view, completely wrong view, is that if there is poverty, for example, or if you see workers not quite getting the jobs that they want to, then make some more transfers available and they should be okay. Well, that's not the future of work. That's not sustainable to keep taxing those in work and giving money to those out of work. The way to move forward here is to make sure that there are jobs for everyone, that those jobs pay well, and that there are jobs that promote well-being. If we don't manage that well, then we could have bad outcomes, which could lead to the breakdown of society and extremely high inequalities, which is what should be avoided if we want it to be sustainable. Now, what do we know currently about this new economic growth? Some people claim that economic growth, artificial intelligence in particular, and automation, as I just described, will bring the end of work. Others believe that job replacements over the next decade will be very small. There are extremes, and they're debating it. The only thing we can say with any certainty, which may not be very helpful at the present stage, is that artificial intelligence in the next phase of economic growth is not going to be like the phase that we're experiencing with the introduction of computers and the introduction of robotics, where the main people suffering from that were the low-skilled workers, and high-skilled workers were always benefiting, which is the reason that we experience this rising inequality. That artificial intelligence is affecting also groups of highly skilled workers in a way that we're not sure yet, so we don't know exactly how we could manage it. Now, what could companies do in this context? And this is very important. It's very important because companies have a choice on how to approach these new technologies. And I'm using it here as an example, electricity. I do believe that electricity was, excuse me, Okay, I do believe that electricity was a much bigger invention and a much bigger industrial revolution than artificial intelligence. You're probably not following news from Britain, but unless you live in Britain, but there was a big storm here only last week that disconnected some parts in the north of the country from electricity. And it was a main news items, and people were complaining that how could they live? They couldn't heat themselves, they couldn't cook. Something had to be done quickly because they were very miserable. Well, imagine if we lost our access to the internet for a week. Is it going to be news where everyone will say we cannot live our lives because of that? I'm sure we would live our lives almost as comfortable as now, but obviously not with the same facilities. Now, however, what's very different this time than before is that when inventions like electricity or railways were coming along, companies didn't really have much of a choice. They simply changed their power sources, from steam to electricity, or from horsepower to the internal combustion engine, and they carried on. Whereas now they do have a choice, and that's where the difficulty lies with the fourth industrial revolution as opposed to the previous ones. I do believe, though, rather strongly that the challenge we're facing now is not how to help work not to end, but how to bring about the transition from what we had before to what new jobs will be created. Because new jobs, I believe, will be created. There is human ingenuity to create jobs if you want them. In fact, there is another famous saying from John F. Kennedy here, where exactly what we're debating now, we're being debated in the 1960s, because artificial intelligence came along in 1958 with a very big conference on what's happening in our labor markets because of digital technologies. And what JFK at that time said is that if we are so clever as to invent these new technologies to take jobs away from people, surely we're clever enough to create new jobs that cannot be taken over by technology. And he was absolutely right about that. But that's a challenge that we are facing today. I think we will succeed if you look at history, because if you look back at employment and unemployment rates in advanced countries, they've remained virtually flat for decades. And that's because each time there was some new technology that was destroying jobs, some new types of jobs were being invented. Now, what is the question, however, is what's required to meet this challenge? And I believe that the requirement is along three pillars, if you say, if you like. The first one is the institutional structure of the country. How favorable is it for adoption of the new technologies, from open market activity, which will give you a rise in incomes across the country. And for that, we know now that big monopolies, for example, don't help. Corruption doesn't help. Does it have a good infrastructure, currently a good digital infrastructure? Is it respecting privacy rights? Is there enough access to finance? Are there incentives for innovation? All these are the institutional structures. When I compare earlier North and South Korea, that's exactly what North Korea doesn't have. It doesn't have an institutional structure for economic growth, and that's why it's not getting it. Second, we need good education and skills. Is there a plentiful supply of qualified labor that can work with the new technologies? And finally, we need government policy towards companies and households. Do they operate a good tax structure? Do they give incentives for men and women to enter productive employment, something that not all countries have to a satisfactory degree? Do they provide good data, clean data that can be used by companies and people? And do they help in the education and training? I'm going to say a lot more later about government policy. Now, Our recent report on the Greek economy that was mentioned by Mr. Papazoglou earlier on is based exactly on these principles. Reform the market environment, give incentives to men and women to enter the labor force, and encourage better education at all levels. We make proposals to give incentives to companies to innovate and grow and create good salary jobs, and incentives to banks and international investors to invest in productive activities. I will expand on what I just said about the principles, but I will not go into the details of the report we did on Greece. I will rather focus on general principles, which of course are the principles that are underlying our report. Now, what are these general principles that I want to highlight? First of all, where is the job creation going to come from? Now, to many people, when we talk about modern technologies and the kind of jobs that they will create, we immediately think of the big digital companies. We think of Apple, of Google, of Facebook, and other digital giants. Those companies create some jobs for highly qualified and innovative people. They're important because they drive innovation. But you might be surprised to hear that I don't believe that they're the companies that will employ the majority of people that come out of the education system. In other words, if we rely on these companies for job creation, we're going to end up with a lot of unemployment. And we shouldn't be doing that. Government policies shouldn't be directed to that as a source of job creation. Where job creation will come from is mainly, when I say mainly, is big difference from sectors that include that involve social interaction. And the reason for that, of course, is that social interaction cannot be mechanized yet. However you think of the mechanization, we still have to rely on people for that. Now, as societies develop, citizens increase their demand for personal services, good quality social care, specialized healthcare. These are what economists call luxury goods, in the sense that if your income rises by some percentage, say by 2%, 10%, then your demand for these services rises by more than 10%. And that's why demand for these services will be increasing over time when as incomes are rising. Now, the satisfaction for these demands cannot come from artificial intelligence or robotics. Will have to come from people. And these sectors are entirely in these subsectors that I described. These services are provided by what we call the service sector of the country. And that's why we see so many advanced countries, United States, United Kingdom, even Germany, we see them becoming service societies. Now, that's a good development. Unfortunately, it hasn't been very good during COVID. COVID-19 hasn't been kind to the service sector. But sooner or later, we'll be over the pandemic, or we're going to work ways around it, the way we work ways around flu, for example. And we're going to go back to seeing the service sector grow. That's inevitable. It's part of the process of economic development. The alternative, now we need to do something about that. We need to make sure that the jobs created in that service sector are good. The alternative, of course, is to sit back, let digital companies dominate, leave them unregulated. If we do that, the service sector will lag more and more behind, and we're not going to get sustainable economic growth. Now, inclusive growth requires good educational skills and requires to deal with inequality, which will grow, as I mentioned, if we leave it alone. Can I be more specific on what needs to be done there? I can, and I can tell you in a minute if I manage to bring the right slide up. Okay. Now, I mentioned that the digital companies are the ones that would drive innovation. We do need to take care of that, and I have some remarks here about that we require new types of skills, especially we require technical skills. These are known by the acronym STEM, Science, Technology, Engineering, Mathematics, and those need to start from school. In fact, if anything, even from preschool. Mathematics and engineering and subjects like that ought to be taught at school, ought to be made like part of a game, problem solving. So, which is something that we're not very good at. The universities, as we progress through the education system, of course, the highly qualified people who are going to be the innovative people will come out of universities. The universities need to adapt their curricula to them. Not many have curricula that are directed in this kind of training. I'm afraid curriculum universities are not doing very well in that respect. Not many universities in the world, in fact, are doing well. Only the top US universities and some Northern European ones are doing well. We do need to do a lot more about that. Now, formal education, however, is only a basis for what specialization will take place later on. The way I think of formal education is as a portfolio of skills. You learn a little bit of many different kinds of skills. And as you come out of school, you choose companies, you shop between companies, you choose a company that suits your skills, and then you get further training in those companies. Lifelong learning continues throughout employment. You might need to change employer and change skill. That's to be expected when technology is changing so fast. And then it gets out of the education system, how to train initially, and falls onto companies how to provide their own training. This is something that Greece is not doing very well, I'm afraid, and we do outline again in our report what needs to be done to start the reform process. In that training at universities, at schools and universities is not very good, and then training in companies following that is not very good either. Now, given time limitations, which I haven't checked, I should skip the conditions that are required for good training success and move on to the next challenge. Yeah, the next kind of skill. Now, I mentioned STEM subjects as being extremely important given the digital technologies that we're adopting. But as I emphasized before, most jobs will come out of in the provision of social services where there's social interaction. Here, the sectors will be the hospitality industry, tourism, of course, is one of them, but restaurants, hotels, theaters, creative activities. That's where the jobs for the future are going to be. And the care sector, care for children and old people, sick people. These are what I described earlier as the sort of luxury services that will be demanded more and more. And education and training in these skills is very, very rare at school. They're hardly mentioned, in fact, in most high school or even elementary school education. But if that's what most people will be doing, then obviously we need both formal training in that through the education system, giving you a background of what it means to provide good social service, and also training in the job once it's decided what sector the person is going to enter. Now, from what I was saying, I'm sorry, I hadn't realized I switched to Greek. Here we're back to English. I was saying that the new technologies that we're seeing will require a bigger government. It will require bigger government first in the ways that I described so far, but even more importantly, because we don't know exactly what the new technologies are doing to our economy and to society as a whole, the government will have to take on a bigger role in regulating the new technology. Data privacy, for example, is a big issue. And we have the GDPR in Europe, which is a first step, much better than what there is in the United States and other places, but much better than what there is in Britain, in fact, now that after Brexit. But it's only a first step. We've seen fraudulent abuse of technologies from Facebook and Cambridge Analytica, for example. And there are many other concerns. Digital cameras have enormous power to influence public opinion and behavior, and that needs to be regulated by government. We've seen jobs move away from organized labor into the gig economy, where there is no control whatsoever. Gig jobs, I believe, need to be protected by government. There are inequalities and there is poverty at work, and governments need to initiate programs, for example, through clever systems for minimum wages to mitigate those problems. What I just said here, I think, are is the most important new role for government, and it's not easy. I mean, you need technocrats to apply this, but not leave it in the hands of politicians. But obviously, politicians will have the ultimate responsibility, but they have to get suitably trained technocrats to do that. Now, another role for government that will have to grow big is social spending. Because we have aging populations and we do need to have a good pension system, I believe one that is based on a non-contributory pension as a basic requirement, but then supplemented by contributory pensions. We need to have good quality health services, which should be subsidized again to avoid sickness which cannot be dealt because the private means are missing. The care services I mentioned earlier for children and older persons, they need to be provided by, or at least regulated by governments. And of course, we have the disabled, large groups, and the unemployed who will need social support in order to be reintegrated into the labor force. All these things give you an agenda, if you like, for government that is going to be much more technical in the future, one that will have to rely on technocrats that stay in their jobs for many, many years. They don't follow politicians in and out, as we have in our democracy, 4 or 5 years maximum. And we need to rethink the role of government if we're going to succeed in sustainable and inclusive economic growth. I can stop here to have some discussion. I'm very sorry about the technicalities. I've never used this system before, and it didn't quite work as well as the organizers told me before it was going to work, because it's a tiny screen here and I couldn't see very well what I was saying. Anyway.
Sir Pissarides, thank you very much for a self-explanatory presentation on the components, I would say, of an inclusive growth. So having you today with us, I'm very much tempted to raise a couple of challenging questions, if I may. And starting, as we know, already a year elapsed after the release of your committee's report on the Greek economy and its way forward. And a lot has happened since then, in the local as well as the global environment. With today's eyes, would you change anything from your initial suggestions to the Greek state? And if I may, is there any one thing that you should suggest today to the Greek state that we should be focusing on to become successful in the years to come?
Well, our report actually was, it was a general report on the performance of the Greek economy up to about a year ago when we did it. And then it was addressing all those issues that we felt needed updating to achieve the objective that we set in mind. And the main objective that we set in mind was an economy that had higher productivity and competitiveness, because once you have the productivity and competitiveness, then you can pay more, incomes are higher, and you can export more, you can have bigger companies, bigger new technologies. And then we went back and said, in order to achieve the higher productivity, what do we need? We need more investment. Then where is the investment going to come from? Well, the banking system was almost just coming out of the virtual bankruptcy, so there isn't much there. So we have to rely on foreign investment. And then the question is, what can make foreign investors look at Greece as a destination, which they are looking at now, by the way, much more than they did before. And again, there is a number of factors there. The judicial system, in fact, is quite important in that, because it's the one that will preserve the property rights on their investments. If something goes wrong, they don't want to wait 7 or 10 years before they can get a decision. They needed a good digital infrastructure, a good transportation system, a good internet installation everywhere, and so on. So if you look at it that way, there isn't just one thing that you can do and it will open up all the horizons. There are things that complement each other. You know, I cannot tell you, oh, you know, focus on education reform and then everything else will be okay, because everything else will not be okay. There will be, investors will say, okay, education will yield results in 5 to 10 years from now. What about this very moment where I'm here now? So I'm afraid I'm not going to give you an answer that will satisfy you that here it is, do A, B, but don't do C, D, E until later. Everything needs to be tackled at the same time, because everything is complementing each other.
Okay, thank you. So moving to another question is, what is your view on Europe's current economic trends? Do you believe that inflation will pervade? And what are the key risks to your mind for a sustainable, inclusive growth in Europe?
Now about Europe, in fact, I'm much more optimistic now than I was during the debt crisis of 10 years ago. Because, I mean, I don't think inflation is as important as politicians and central bankers, especially German central bankers, seem to think. Inflation is something that in normal circumstances, you control it. Okay, fair enough. People don't like seeing price rises, so control it. But in exceptional circumstances, I think it's a bit silly to attach extreme importance to inflation when the rest of the world is collapsing. And during the debt crisis, I said that many times, and I got criticized very heavily by especially by German central bankers, but others as well, in that we were seeing the banking system collapse, we were seeing the fiscal systems collapse, the debt crisis in the South, and they were saying, no, don't allow more liquidity to come into the system because it will raise inflation above 2%. Well, so what? Make it go 4%, 5%. So at last now we're seeing that happening. Given the COVID recession, given the new technologies that are coming on that will require all these challenges that I described before, it would be silly to squeeze the economy further now to bring inflation down to 2%. Let it go up to 4, 5, 6. I don't care. I don't care as much about that as I do about the job loss that is coming with COVID and the uncertainties of now you are in a job, now you're out of a job, and so on, given that we have service economies. So I'm much more optimistic about the way that the crisis is being handled now in Europe. The program they voted in is extremely good. If countries are careful on how to take advantage of it, and the signs in Greece so far are good, I have to say. I'm very optimistic. And generally, I guess you'll not be surprised to hear it, but I made cautious decision to stay and live in Europe because I like it much more than the alternatives. Because of its social care, this care about privacy, about controlling the big monopolies, the digital monopolies. And what I'm really, despite the fact that I'm based in Britain, what I look forward to is to see even more European integration along all dimensions. When it comes to Greece, however, it's extremely important that it takes advantage of this European integration because the small economy is too small to prosper on its own. And it's got a huge door open in front of it, which is the single European market. And the fact that our leaders have treated equally respectfully as any other leader in Europe, however big the country you're representing. And not to take advantage of that because of some ancient rigid laws and practices that we've had in difficult times in the 1950s, 60s, it's so difficult to comprehend that that's what motivated me to spend so much time on my report, to give up everything else I had to do here and write that report in the hope that things would improve. I didn't vote for Brexit, as you can imagine from this talk.
Thank you. Obviously, I have many more questions. A discussion with you always is a pleasure. But mindful of time, I have to thank you here very much for being with us today. And Elias, back to you.
Thank you.
Papazoglou, thank you very much for your very enlightening conversation we had here. We appreciate being with us, and we will continue our program in a short. Thank you.